Building a world is the hardest and most exciting part about creating a story. I sat down and talked with sci-fi author Bryan Glosemeyer of the space opera series Before the Shattered Gates of Heaven to learn his steps in creating a believable science fiction setting. If you're a fan of science fiction and you love hearing how authors hone their craft, sit back and enjoy. So
Dun,
we
dun,
have
dun.
so we're here. We have this is episode 3 of Storycomic Presents, and I have with me in talking in the virtual studio. I don't know what to call it really. It's not like
Live from my living room floor.
and live from my basement. Storycomic. All right. And so what we have in there, we have with us the author, acclaimed science fiction author, Bryan Glosemeyer of San Francisco. So you just recently have put out a series of novellas. It's a box set. It looks like of Before the Shattered Gates of Heaven.
That's right. Yeah.
Looking at it on Amazon, and we'll put a link into the show notes about it. A lot of great reviews on it. A lot of people are talking about it. There's a lot of buzz about it as well. And you have been working on this book, and you're working on the sequel to it now, correct?
Yeah. I'm deep into the sequel as we speak. I'm doing a quick revision pass of the second act before I dive into the third act. Yeah.
Okay.
So I hope to have the first draft done in the next couple months.
Okay. Wow. So my question, like, I remember when we were first talking about this, and you're saying, you're writing this series, and I, for one, I've always loved science fiction.
Mm-hmm.
I've never jumped. I've always felt more comfortable in like the fantasy side of settings where you're adding in like, the magic and like like the background and the mythology of all that stuff. Now,
Mm-hmm.
what made you before we start really talking about the science fiction and the world building aspect of what you did, because you've created a pretty expansive universe. So what made you start? We always say people always have a story to tell. Everybody has a
Right.
story to tell. Why did you pick the medium of writing to be your your pencil, I guess, your medium?
Right. One of the things I really love about writing, specifically like story writing or novel writing, is that you don't have to really rely on anybody but yourself. If you're writing a comic book, for say, if you're not an artist, then you've got to rely on that artist to bring your vision to life. If you want to try to write a screenplay, heaven help you. I mean, it literally takes thousands and thousands of people. I mean, we've all seen the closing credits of a movie, how long that goes on, especially if it's something like science fiction, to get that made. But if you want to write a book, all you need is the time and the patience and the wherewithal to get your behind in the chair day after day after day and get it done. You're not relying on anybody else. In most cases, there's also co-writing. So I have always wanted to do artistic stuff all my life. When I was like 8 years old, I used to write short stories about ninjas and stuff like that. And then as I got a little bit older, I actually got into music, and I really devoted. When I first met you, I think I was still playing music all the time.
Right.
And then post college, I got really into photography and photojournalism. And then a common acquaintance of ours asked me to join him to write a book together, on a writing project together. I was like, wow, that sounds really, really hard, but let's give it a shot. That project eventually fell through and never came to fruition, but it implanted in me the bug that I had back when I was 8 years old, about how much I enjoyed writing. And so I really just dug into the craft, listening to all the books on writing, and podcasts on writing and YouTube videos on writing, and working on stuff, getting it to people for feedback, and working on it again. And it's what keeps me sane in this world for the most part.
So
I've noticed that if I'm not writing,
yeah.
I
So
was
it's
like,
like,
oh, I got to get my butt in the chair and do something.
yeah, it's kind of like be able to like tame some of those anxieties. I know a lot of artists will use that as therapy as well as is that whatever they do, whether it be drawing, writing, sculpture, all that kind of stuff. Now, tell me, now, how long did it take you to write your first book?
So the first book, I did 4 drafts of it altogether. So from beginning the first draft to hitting the publish button took 4 years. And a lot of that was just, when you're writing your first book, you're not only writing your first book, you're learning how to write a book, and learning how to put your scenes together and learning how to edit and revise and get feedback. And then you're like, oh, I need to work on all the dialogues. And then you work on all the dialogue, and like, oh, I need to work on all my scene construction. And then you're working on your scene construction. And like, oh, I need to make sure that my world building makes sense. So you work on and then you go through multiple drafts. And I worked with a professional editor, worked with a professional cover designer to eventually get there. And in the meantime, there was family stuff going on, got married, changed jobs. No, marriage happened beforehand, now that I think about the timeline. But just lots of stuff, life was happening while I was writing that first book. And I've talked to other writers and listened to other podcasts, and everyone always says, the first book takes the longest.
Huh. So what do you it's before we dive into talk about your stuff, who's your inspiration? Who do you listen to, or who did you read a lot that you would recommend that if people that like science fiction that you've connected really well with?
I really fell in love with Neil Stevenson. And though he doesn't necessarily write in the same subgenre as me, which is space opera, he's really at the top of the game in science fiction authors for the past couple of decades. And his book Snow Crash, which is one of his earlier books, it was actually a cyberpunk book, just had so much energy and fun and inventiveness that it just blew me away. And I strive every time to be able to get all of that energy and submersiveness that he creates in his books, especially, like I said, in Snow Crash, into what I'm writing.
They have, and you mentioned, we just talked about, you said a space opera. How would you define that as a subgenre of science fiction?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, science fiction is a huge genre. It's anything from, alternate history to techno thrillers set in the modern day to, alien invasion to near future and cyberpunk to adventures in outer space and worlds beyond. And, like a lot of people in our generation, I grew up with Star Wars. And that's always been a touch point in my life. As much as I absolutely love fantasy and really adore a lot of what's happening in all kinds of fantasy, urban fantasy, epic fantasy, heroic fantasy, it was really the idea of having, spaceships and aliens that that just was undeniably cool to me.
So one of the reasons why we wanted to sit down and talk today is really talk about what it means to, from a science fiction perspective, what it means to build, world building.
Mm-hmm.
Now, for instance, Tolkien, what he did is he first started writing languages. He first started,
right.
and then he wrote the Silmarillion. So he actually created like history and religion from the background to then give himself a pretty strong foundation on the Lord of the Rings series. So what did you do? How did you first say, listen, I'm going to sit down, I have this story to tell? Or did you first have decided to build a world first and then figure out what story you wanted to tell in that world? And how did you start building that world? What was the first few
Mhm.
sketches that you had in your writer's Bible there that you used, that you wrote
Yeah,
down?
so actually I started the opposite direction. I started with the character and the character's journey first. And I would advise that to as many people as much as possible. Start with the story. The world building should always be in service to the story. The story should never be in service to the world building. Um, so you can definitely world build more than you'll ever see on the page, and many writers do, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it can also lead you down rabbit hole after rabbit hole after rabbit hole that has nothing to do with getting your book finished. And anybody who's ever written something really long knows this is like it's never done until you actually sit down and write it and get it finished. So yeah, I started with the character. I knew the journey that I wanted that character to go on internally as well as externally. I'm trying not to give too many spoilers away, but if I were to give a summary, I would say it's kind of like Spartacus meets Dances with Wolves set in outer space.
Okay.
So I knew that there were those kind of three elements there of that character's journey, and then I had to create the world around her that would be the impetus for where she started off in life to where she ends up at the end of the book, and what happens, of course, in the middle.
Hmm. Now, so let's talk about a bit when it comes to like science fiction is you have I've always considered like the technology piece of science fiction is like the replacement of fantasy with like their magic system or
Mm-hmm.
whatever that be. So when you've created, so set us up also as for the audience to give us a background, give us a painting of what this world is that what this world is that you've created in your book series before the Shattered Gates of Heaven. Just give us kind of a background of what of the backdrop of
Okay.
your series.
So the main character Sabira is a young lady who lives on an alien world that's actually quite cruel to humans. It is what you could call an alien theocracy. So there is actually, as you talked about in fantasy, there's a lot of mythology built into the world. There's a lot of political structure, societal structure built into the world, where she is the lowest of the lowest of the low, yet is still completely faithful and bought into her society and this theocratic structure that she finds herself in. And so I had to, you know, what, and that led to, okay, so if this is that world, how did it get that way? Who are these aliens? Why do these aliens have these beliefs? How did human beings get to be in this society? Why do they believe what they believe under the aliens? And then so that's the starting point. And then as the character journeys on and gets exposed to the larger the universe around her, she finds her faith deeply shaken as she comes across new realizations and new encounters, and has to decide if she's going to choose a life of loyalty and submission and somewhat know her place in this world, or a life of mystery and danger, and leave her old world behind.
And you mentioned the different alien species.
Mm-hmm.
What I love about science fiction as compared to fantasy is that that it's so much easier to escape from many of those science fiction tropes because they're so boundless compared to like fantasy where if you pick up a fantasy book, you expect elves, you expect gnomes, you
Mm-hmm.
expect dwarfs, and in certain genres. But with science fiction, how was it creating different alien species?
It's pretty fun. And I wish that more fantasy did that as well. I think there's no reason why fantasy always has to be humans, elves, and dwarves and orcs. You know, if you, there's no reason why you can't do something that's just as alien in a fantasy world. Maybe that would just be too far afield for what people expect. But um, you know, like I said, I created this alien world and this belief structure and this deep history. And then there's more. So there's the history of what the characters know, like what we might call the mythology of the state and the religion. And then there's the real history that the characters eventually discover. And I think that's really important whenever you're doing world building in any situation, whether it's fantasy, science fiction, or even more like realistic crime thrillers or whatnot. If you're building a world around your character, there's always, history is always written by the winners, and there's always somebody else who has someone to say, actually, if you look closely, it didn't really happen that way. It happened this way. And if you ask around somebody else, they might have a completely different opinion about what happened in the past. And depending how much your characters buy into which historical thread is going to really determine, like, what their choices are and where they're coming from in their society.
So what's your cast of different alien species? What do you have?
So in the first book, there are primarily three species. There are humans. There are I won't go into the alien names, but there are the war seers, the overseers, and the god seers, which are like three different ethnic branches of this alien society that controls the Holy Unity, where Sabira lives. And then above them are the divine masters, who are the peak of that society. And we don't ever actually see them in the first book yet. Just much as, like, if you were in ancient Rome and you were one of the chain gang slaves working, in the mines, you were never going to see the emperor or the senators or the ruling class. You would just see your overseers, and it's very much a situation like that.
Huh.
And then the Holy Unity has their enemy, which is known as the monarchy, which is composed of several different alien races. But the main alien race you see is the Vlees, which I originally had being like basically giant insects, humanoid insects. But then I was like, the humanoid insect thing has been troped a bit too much. I mean, you see it in Rick and Morty all the time, and you see it in things like the old Battlestar Galactica and blah blah blah. So I started that. Like, I kept some of those traits. Like, I gave them three limbs. So they have four arms and two legs.
Okay.
And they have some insect-like behaviors. Like, they have a thing called dusk song, where the whole community comes together and sings every night when the sun goes down, much like cicadas and grasshoppers would do. But they aren't actually insects. They're their own alien kind of life form. But I just kind of took insect-like qualities to infuse into them, and then branch off from that.
So, what's complicated, I guess, is the difference between, I would say, from any type of other world building is when you're working in science fiction and you have different species, different races. Is it the challenge that you're facing is that what you'd have to do is then create worlds and histories for, like, multiple times. You're doing it for one alien species and you're doing it for another species. And then you also look at it from the geological perspective of
Mm-hmm.
how their planets are formed. And how much of a deep dive did you do before you sat down to write the book? That you did, just creating the whole history of every species before you actually put pen to paper?
Beforehand, not really that much. I had some basic notes. Like, I thought for a long time before I ever actually got the guts to actually start writing this. Um, so I had it just bubbling around in my head. I said it took 4 years to get the whole thing together, but I had it bubbling around in my head for probably 2 or 3 years before that. And whenever I would get an idea, I'd write it down and I'd take notes, and sometimes the notes would contradict each other. But for the most part, the real nitty gritty of the world building came as I was writing. As I was mentioned, earlier, you really need your world building to service the story, not the other way around. So it's like once I got to, so I started off in the Holy Unity, and you see the war seers and the overseers and whatnot, and then we get to the Vlies planet in the middle of the book. And that's when I really started. I had some basic ideas, but that's when I really started working on the Vlies basically as I was going. Like, I developed stuff around their architecture and their belief systems and their history, but it was very much as I did what was needed for the book and left enough there. So like I did kind of the ice cube or the iceberg method, where you just see enough for hopefully you buy into the world, but you have the sense that there's a much bigger iceberg underneath the surface of the text, that isn't necessarily always deeply worked out, because like I said, you could work on that for years and years and years and never move your story forward. So the world building was always in service to the book. Now, for the second book, which I'm working on now, I did try a little bit of a different tack, and I did actually do a lot of world building first. And I really wanted to sit down and develop a lot of because in the following books, it was going to get the world that the character goes through is going to get more and more expansive, more and more planets, more and more political organizations, more and more religious organizations. And so I felt like I wanted to dig into that more. So I had kind of a template of where I would go with the story. But for the first book, it was pretty much, I created it as I went, and then filled it out with revisions and revisions and revisions and whatnot.
So as an author, somebody who writes, what are some of the pieces that you feel as though that you might be, I would say, lacking when it comes to world building? I'll give you an example. For one, for me, is like when I started doing some stuff as a someone who likes to draw, I drew out maps first. I was drawing out maps and all that kind of stuff, and then from there, I kind of struggled a lot with like creating, languages and the cultures behind that. So what are the parts of that when you sit down and you want to start digging a bit deeper in that? Do you go as deep as making maps and creating what these holidays are in different subcultures of each planet, or how deep do you dive when you make these worlds?
That's a good question, and it can vary up a little bit. I think what I probably have maybe what I would say the hardest time is making the cultures not seem monolithic. Because when you look around you, like even much beyond just the United States, but you go into any specific state or any specific city, and you see tons and tons of variation in different cultures and then subcultures of those cultures and different habits, even just within a single neighborhood. Especially in a city like San Francisco, where there's just people from all over the world living around you and pretty good peacefully most of the time. So the hardest thing is because you want to create a world that makes sense and isn't completely overwhelming detail for the reader, but at the same time, like, cultures are extremely complex, and cultures are not monolithic. Ethnicities and religious creeds and what have you aren't monolithic. There's always going to be tons of variation within that. So finding that right amount of variation and right amount of this is what a basic person in this society would be like can be difficult. And I think that's something I'm working on more in my second book.
And do you know...
Making me reveal all my flaws, Barney. Come on.
But it's so hard. I mean, if you think about it too, it's so, I mean, and it really looks at from that the anthropology of it is like how our culture is initially created. Is it created by geography, climate? It's how much of it is just based off of where somebody is, and like is it from just the actual place where they live grows
Mm-hmm.
from society to the the creation of architecture and religion and shared values. You come from a lot of that. And it's because you think about it, if you're a nation, if you're an island nation, your values are going to look different than if you are if you're a culture that's been formed through in the middle of the wilderness.
Mm-hmm.
So
Or if you're like if you're a small country or a small island, or if you're an empire trying to expand its boundaries.
right, yeah. No, one of the things that you mentioned earlier, I wanted to do a little bit more just to really give it that feeling of this is really what you're writing is science fiction, is that you talk about a bit of designing technology. So
Right.
what are some of the things in your world that you actually, as you were designing it, you just smiled to yourself thinking, this is pretty cool? What are some of those, like, what are some of those things where, as your books come out, that people can kind of very distinctly say, like, this is, this definitely feels like a Bryan, reference?
Okay. So there's a few different things. I would say one of the things that I really enjoy, you see it a lot, especially in this first book, is part of the Holy Unity's belief system is that no technology should replace what a living being can do.
Oh, okay.
So they're very kind of so that's their ideal. And then there's what they actually live up to. So there's plenty of actual technology in their society, but their ideal is to have everything be organically or biologically constructed. So that's what they're moving towards as a society, but they haven't achieved yet. So there's a lot of bioengineering, and there's a lot of merging technology with the biology, as kind of a stop point or stopgap to the point where everything can be completely biological as they progress further. So I got to create a bunch of different animals and what I'm calling biomech animals. And I never actually defined what strictly biomech is,
Huh.
um, because how do you define something that doesn't actually exist? Like maybe can't even exist. It'll just exist completely in this world of a technology that's thousands of years more advanced than ours. So that's what I had a lot of fun with, was incorporating biological technology into this spacefaring society, and what's technological and what's biological, and where do they cross over, and how do they manipulate that. So I had a lot of fun with that.
It's interesting that as you talk about, there's a lot of religion that it seems like you're talking. There's a lot of religion in your books.
Mm-hmm.
Is and one of the caveats I've noticed too is that there's, especially in science fiction, is that the more advanced a society is, it seems to have replaced science as a new religion. But
Mm-hmm.
as you're talking about it, one of the things that your stories seem to stick out is that the science seems to enhance the existing religions as the societies have advanced, as you're talking.
Yeah, definitely the technology specifically. Now, there's a lot of flaws with the society that I've created, this holy unity that Sabira is from, and I wanted to not be preachy about it. So I just wanted to put these things in there and then explore it, and then let people kind of make their own realizations or discoveries about the world and the society and the characters in there. Um, but I think that, well, we talked about Tolkien earlier. Tolkien was a linguist first and foremost. Tolkien just loved languages, and the stories were developed to explain why the different elven languages branched off from each other, and all its different all the different elven languages that he created. So he created the stories to explain why that happened. Um, I've always been really fascinated by mythology and by religion and ritual, uh, of all the different, religions and mythologies of the world, and how important that is to history, and how important that is to society, and how it shapes society. I mean, we are a pretty technologically advanced society. I mean, here we are doing this, this live stream with, computers the size of a few stacks of paper, talking to each other live through social media on the web with, tiny, 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 tiny little cameras built in there. And there's, could be hundreds of people watching us, and who knows how many more in the future. Meanwhile, there's a space station, a literal space station, circling the Earth right now, and there's robots on Mars. We're a very technologically advanced society, but religion hasn't gone anywhere. I mean, religion still plays a huge part in how our elections turn out, how nations relate to each other. If you go, in the Middle East, there's going to be a big difference, if you're, Sunni or Shia, depending on what country you're in, like how you're going to be treated. And so I don't think that's going to escape humanity anytime soon, or maybe ever. I think that there is a certain part of the way our brains and our minds are structured to look for meaning, look for structure in the universe, look for our place in the universe, look for agency in the universe. And the human mind is, the conscious mind at least, is structured through story. It's part of the reasons why stories are so much more affecting than raw data. You can change somebody's mind with a story a lot easier than you can change somebody's mind with, a sheet of facts and figures. It's just the truth. And anybody who's in advertising or, trying to get change in the society knows that they have to tell a story. And the most effective people in society are the ones who can get their story across as quickly and succinctly as possible. And religion is, it is stories. It's the stories that unite a group of people, or a group of aliens, or what have you.
That's interesting that you bring up, like, Tolkien was a linguist first. So what he did is he wrote language first
Mm-hmm.
to create his world. And I know that you have, as you said, your passion is mythology and religion. So you've kind of created like a religious ethos for your world to build from. Do you think that's something that other science fiction authors seem to not get right, is really adding in religion to their worlds, and really just mostly and concentrating too much on just the science of it?
Well, I think every author is going to have their own vision and their own things that kind of ignite them. Um, I don't see it very much in a lot of contemporary science fiction and space opera. But if you go into a lot of the roots of science fiction, like Dune, is all about the role that religion plays in society, in this society that's what, like 30-40,000 years ahead of our own. And the God Emperor and Messiah of Dune, it's a huge part of that, and Dune is the best-selling science fiction novel of all time.
Mm.
So I think, and Star Wars, probably the biggest science fiction franchise of all time, and the Jedi and the Force are at the heart of what Star Wars has been for 40 years, since the very beginning. I mean, we all love all that other stuff, Boba Fett and the bounty hunters and the scum and the villainy and the political machinations and whatnot. But every movie is, a Jedi and a Sith going at it, one religion and the other religion. They believe almost exactly the same thing, but it's just enough different that, they'll fight each other to the death over it, over and over and over again.
Right. And what do you have? So when you've created this and you have your world, what's your vision uh, of this franchise that you've created? Where do you see? Do you see it as a trilogy? Do you see it just as a series? And where does that your first book, where does that snapshot take place into the entire timeline of your universe?
So I see it more as a playground where like I said, after I wrote my first book, I took some time and just sat down and did a lot of world building. And part of that was because not just for what I wanted to do in the next book of Sabira's story, but what I wanted to do overall. Like, I just love all kinds of stories, of genre stories. I love heists. I love samurai movies. I love westerns. Um, I love horror. And what I wanted to do was I wanted to create a world that is big and expansive and submersive enough that I could tell any kind of story I wanted to tell. Just I would do it on a different planet or on a spaceship or like that. So right now the big project is to get the second book done, which is the second book of Sabira's story, which is introducing a few more worlds and more societies. But the big goal is to tell not just her story, but which I think will be ongoing past the second book if there's enough interest. Um, but is to tell other stories in this world, some that will take place the same time as Sabira's story. I have one idea already started that would run coincidentally at the same time as Sabira's story, but it just will happen to be on the other side of the galaxy. And I have a free short story that I give away to anybody who subscribes to my newsletter, which you can sign up for at bryansglosemeyer.com. Hey, hey. A free short story that takes place, several hundred years and in a different part of the galaxy from Sabira's story. So really, yeah, like I said, I just want to have this big galactic playground where I can experiment and tell all the different kinds of adventures and stories and characters that I want to do, um, and have it all take place. But Sabira, my main character for this first and second book, she has a pretty epic future ahead of her that I would like to get to you, but it's definitely not the only stories that will be taking place in the universe I created. The Shattered Gates universe, I like to call it.
Your Shattered Gates universe. So, any other mediums that you are planning on trying to do with this, like maybe a tabletop role playing game, graphic novels, board games?
Yeah, exactly. I actually, as part of what I did for my world building after I finished the first book, was I did something rather unusual. I think that most writers wouldn't do, but I absolutely love tabletop role playing. I've never really been a computer gamer. I've always loved getting together with friends and having our sheets of paper and dice and telling stories together. And I wanted to do that with my world. And let me tell you, there's nothing like figuring out how something is going to work until you have to make hard and fast reproducible rules about it. So it's one thing to say, yeah, the technology can do this if I need it to, but if you're going to gamify it and you're going to have, people who have never read your books, in this world playing around, they need to know the rules on how it works, like what it can do at level 1 versus what it can do at level 5, like, how the defenses on this spaceship are going to work against these kind of weapons. And I definitely went down some rabbit holes in that, like game design is no easy task. So one day I do want to get that out into the wider world. I initially did it based off of the White Wolf storytelling system because I was most familiar with it, as a way to get started. But before it, obviously I don't have the rights or the license to go with that. So I'm gonna, once it's ready or I'm ready to go further with that, I'm gonna develop that into more of its own system for dice and rules and character creation and all that. And it's actually kind of cool. I know it might be putting the horse a bit, the cart ahead of the horse a little bit, but The Expanse, which is a great series of books. It's also a great television series. They have a role-playing game. Firefly and Serenity. I think they've actually had multiple role-playing systems come out for them over the years, if I'm not incorrect. I just saw something where Altered Carbon, which started off as books and is now a Netflix series, is getting its own tabletop role-playing game. And there's another indie author like myself, far more ahead of the game with books and whatnot, Chris Fox, who does space fantasy. I saw on Facebook this week that he is starting, I believe, a Kickstarter to get a tabletop role-playing game put out for his space fantasy universe. So it's not like I'm the first person to actually go there, but I think I might have been the first person to use it as a way of figuring out some of the nitty-gritty of my world building.
Have you ever thought of it also as taking your Shattered Gates books and actually making it like an open source world where people could, say here's a part of this planet that people can tell stories about, or anything like that?
I do know that some authors have tried things like that, and Amazon even had a structure for that kind of thing for a while with indie authors, where you could, or even other authors, where you could, legally write within their world. I don't think that lasted very long. I think that might have folded, but I'm not 100% certain. As much fun as that might be, I'm also really protective and greedy. This is my baby,
Yeah.
um, and but maybe at some point when when I've got George Lucas money and I can just sit in my ranch and hire other writers to write 100 more books a year for me, maybe then. But right now, this is my baby. This is my playground. And if you wanna tell great stories in outer space, you know,
Yeah.
go make up your own planets. It's fun.
So how many? So what would you say is if people who are people who are the audience that are listening to this or watching this, what advice would you give them if they are wanting to create? Because what you did is a compared to what other authors and writers do, who might just be telling a story based off of their own life experiences, or they might be telling a story that's pretty pretty small in comparison of creating entire universes. If someone says, what advice would you give them on this is how you should start? Because you did say earlier is like find a person and then that, but when you get into the actual details, what would you say is uh, that this step should come after this step, or what did you see that worked best for you when it came to building a world?
Embrace your mistakes. Embrace the things that you don't even realize were a hole in your world building, and then figure out how to make that work, how to make that make sense. So at the very beginning, this isn't really much of a spoiler because it's the very, 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 very beginning of Before the Shattered Gates of Heaven. The main character has a choice to make for what her place in society will be. And she gets two choices, and that's it, because humans are, like I said, the lowest of the low here. She can either try to prove herself as a gladiator to work her way up to join basically the equivalent of the space army, or she can live as a human incubator, and basically in this society where biology is there to be used by those on top. Some women are what's called hens, and their whole point in the society is to give birth to other people's children so that they don't have to stop work and stop their duties when they're pregnant. And that's what they do, is just they're surrogate mothers over and over and over again. And that was the choice that she was given. And her sister chose to become a hen, and she chose the pit. She chose to try being a gladiator and on towards becoming a soldier. And then so I was in the beginning working on this, trying to get this figured out, and I put it up in like a writers group on Facebook for some feedback, and somebody said, well, why wouldn't they just uh, use like an artificial incubator? You know, why would there even be, this thing of some women having to be hens like this in this world? And I was like, oh yeah. And so suddenly it's like, oh, is that a giant plot hole in my book? So I was like, okay, how am I going to make this work? And that's when I came up with the idea of, oh, there's just going to be this reliance on biology as opposed to, mechanized technology as a sort of ideal in this society. Well, where did that ideal come from? Oh, it came from their belief in the gods, and the gods said that their duty of the divine masters is to unify all life in the galaxy under them to worship the gods. So that one so-called mistake or hole in my world blossomed into a whole new bit of world building and history and motivation. So if someone points out something that doesn't work, figure out how to make it work. You might find something really amazing that can take you into whole new places you hadn't thought of before.
Hmm. So you said too that as you're doing this, it's really good to share it with other people and just kind of say, hey, what do you think of this? What do you think of that? Just having a
Mm-hmm.
new set of eyes on it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Every successful writer out there, I don't care, if they're Stephen King or who, has somebody read their work for them. Stephen King always has his wife read everything he does before his editors or his publishers ever see it. It's really easy to get into your own head, and just because things line up in your head, as you're sitting at the chair, there's so many things that you're not going to catch. There's so many things that you're not going to realize, or how something's going to come across.
Hmm.
So getting feedback from, people whose opinions you value, whether it be, other writers, or, if you just have like friends and relatives who you think would have interesting insights. I mean, if it's somebody who never reads your genre or doesn't read at all, it's probably not the person you want to go to. But if you know people that have opinions that you value, or that have done the work of writing and world building themselves, it's definitely good to get feedback. Not all feedback is necessarily going to help you, but I haven't gotten, every time I've given something for people to read and evaluate, there's always at least one thing that I take from it, if not more. But I've never gotten feedback or extensive feedback where there wasn't at least one little thing that went, oh yeah, that.
So so potential writers, people who are writing right now or creating pretty expansive science fiction fantasy worlds, your recommendation too is to join these good groups that will be able to give you feedback a lot, and I'm assuming you have to do it as well, right? You
Mm-hmm.
to be active in these online communities. If you expect feedback, you should be also providing feedback.
Oh, absolutely. You got to give. You got to give what you want to get.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, there's online writing groups, there's in-person writing groups, there's conferences, there's or some people actually like to, if they have the money and the time, they'll work with a developmental editor from the very beginning. People that know the craft of storytelling and the craft of putting stories together from start to finish. And if they have the money, you can work with a developmental editor to bounce ideas off of
Mm.
from the very beginning. But if nothing else, find a writers group on Facebook or Twitter or wherever you might be, and see if you can get some feedback, and also give feedback to others. Give what you want to get, and then once you get some readers of your own, you can start reaching out to them and say, hey, you liked this, would you mind reading this for me? I could really use some feedback before I go on to my next draft. And start cultivating beta readers and fans that will want to
Mm.
read your stuff and give it back to you. But that takes time. It takes time.
And what's the word I'm looking for? what's the cultural norm when it comes to getting feedback, and then you were also reading some things. Have you ever read something from somebody else, being a beta reader for somebody else, and said, that is a really cool idea? And like, would you say, can I use this? Is there where like is there have you read some really cool ideas and thought, I I want to put this in my book too?
Not from people that I was beta reading, but I have seen stuff, in other like published books that I've read that like there's a really great book called The Quantum Thief, which has some really cool ideas about uh, duplicating human minds. So using masses of duplicated human minds as opposed to using AI. And I had already been playing with some similar ideas. You can see something like that in Black Mirror in a few different episodes. I think they call them cookies there. Um, so I had already been playing with those ideas, but I hadn't quite figured out how I wanted to do it. And then when I saw the extensive world building that the author Hanu Rajanimi, I think I probably butchered his name, but the author of Quantum Thief, when I saw what he did with that idea, I didn't, just copy it structure for structure, but I went, oh, okay, this is how somebody took that idea and went really, really far with it. And it gave me some light bulbs about how I can develop my similar idea in my own ways and what could be done with it. But I think the important thing to understand is that you don't want to rip anybody off and plagiarize from anybody, but at the same time, like ideas are cheap. Like I said, like this whole idea of like duplicating minds. I've already said like two other places where this is being used extensively.
Mm,
Um, Before that I didn't even know about when I first started playing with that idea. So ideas are cheap. Execution is everything.
mm.
Whether you can take that idea and fit it into a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end that's coherent and works. That's totally something else.
Mm.
I mean, look at Star Wars. You could say that there's tons of influences that came from obviously from Dune, but also from like Isaac Asimov's Foundation and samurai movies. Those are ideas that were out there, but Star Wars is Star Wars. No one else did Star Wars. So it's really all about the execution and following through and putting your own stamp on it, more than it is having, oh, my precious, precious ideas.
So we're wrapping up. This was a pretty quick hour. So
Yeah, it went fast. It's been great.
told you. So for the listeners out there, how can they reach you? Where can they find more about your work?
As I mentioned earlier, if you'd like to get on my monthly newsletter, you can just go to bryansglosemeyer.com and sign up for it there. I never, ever, ever give your email or any details away to anybody else, and never will. You'll get a free short story if you sign up, and it's a great way to see what I'm up to and hear updates about my books and promotions and events like this. And you can always reach out to me through the newsletter. I'm also active on Facebook. So I believe it's facebook.com/Bryan S. Glosemeyer. Um, and I'm also on Instagram, not as much. It's more every now and then. But I don't even remember. What did I? I think my Instagram link was
Was it Doom Bunny Bryan?
yeah, Doom Bunny Bryan. Instagram.com/Doom Bunny Bryan.
Yeah.
And then if you go on to right now, currently my book is only available as an ebook on Amazon. It will eventually go wide to other platforms, and there will eventually be a print edition of the book before the end of this year. But I want to finish up the first draft of book 2 before I go back into publishing mode and getting the print edition out and going wide with that.
Mm.
But yeah, find me on Facebook. Find me on my newsletter. I'd love to hear from you. I'd love geeking out, talking about science fiction and fantasy and books and TV shows, and the process of writing and being creative, and music that goes with it, and everything else. So I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, this has been great, Bryan. I tell you, I've always been passionate, and I've loved the concept of building worlds and cultures, and never really quite understood, had some ideas of how to do it from that science fiction perspective. So this has been really fun, and I'm excited. As I say, and we talked earlier, I'm halfway through the first the first installment of your book. It's split into 4 novellas.
Right. I originally published it as serialized in 4 novellas, and then I recently put out a box set collection of the 4 novellas. So if you buy the box set, it's essentially like buying a novel.
Right. Yeah.
So yeah, it was originally serialized in 4 novellas. I tried that as an experiment with marketing. Didn't really like how it came out. So in the future, everything will just be full novels and not novellas first.
Yeah.
But it was worth an experiment for the first book.
No, it's good. Yeah. So thank you very much, Bryan. And we'll look
Thanks
forward
for
to,
having me.
yeah, look forward to having you coming back on and talking more about it when you're ready to share with your second book. So
yeah, anytime. Let's do it again. I'm always ready to geek out and talk about creativity. It was a blast.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, man. Take care.
I got my nice sleepy time tea with me. So because I think this conversation is going to be so exciting, I just have to calm myself down with some chamomile.